Jimmy Cliff rushed from his father's funeral to perform at a concert. What happened on stage that night left everyone speechless. It was November 15th, 1977, when Jimmy Cliff received the devastating phone call that would force him to make one of the most difficult decisions of his career. His father, Leslie Chambers, had passed away suddenly from a heart attack at their family home in St. James Parish, Jamaica, just hours before Jimmy was scheduled to perform the most important concert of his life at London's Royal Albert Hall. Jimmy was in his luxurious hotel room at the Savoy in London, preparing meticulously for what was being billed as his breakthrough performance for British audiences, when his sister Patricia called with the heartbreaking news that would test his commitment to his artistic mission against his sacred obligation to his family during their time of greatest need and emotional devastation. "Jimmy, you need to come home immediately," Patricia said through her tears, her voice breaking with grief and shock that seemed to echo across the transatlantic phone line. "Papa died this morning around 10 o'clock. The doctor said it was his heart. He was working in the garden, tending to his beloved banana trees, and he just collapsed without warning. We tried to get him to the hospital, but it was too late. He was already gone." The news hit Jimmy like a devastating physical blow, leaving him stunned and unable to process the reality that his father, the man who had taught him about music and consciousness-raising principles, was gone forever from this world. Leslie Chambers had been Jimmy's greatest supporter and spiritual guide throughout his entire career, encouraging his son's artistic development while ensuring he remained grounded in Jamaican cultural values and family responsibilities that transcended individual success. Leslie had been a deeply respected member of their community in St. James Parish, known throughout the region for his wisdom, integrity, and profound understanding of reggae's spiritual significance as more than mere entertainment, but as consciousness-raising education that could transform lives and inspire people to overcome adversity through unwavering faith and determination. The elderly man had worked as a construction foreman for over 30 years, while also serving as a lay minister at their local Methodist church, where he had taught Jimmy about the spiritual responsibility that came with artistic gifts and the obligation to serve consciousness-raising purposes that benefited entire communities rather than individual ambitions. Jimmy's relationship with his father had been the absolute foundation of his artistic development and spiritual understanding, with Leslie teaching him from childhood that music should serve purposes greater than personal fame or commercial success, but should uplift people's spirits and provide consciousness-raising guidance during difficult times in their lives, when they needed hope and inspiration most desperately. Leslie had been the one who first introduced Jimmy to the guitar when he was 8 years old, patiently teaching him chord progressions while explaining how music could communicate spiritual messages that transcended language barriers to reach people's hearts directly and inspire them to become better versions of themselves through consciousness-raising awakening. The timing of his father's death created an impossible situation for Jimmy, who was contractually obligated to perform at Royal Albert Hall that evening for an audience of 5,000 people who had traveled from across Europe to witness what many considered reggae's formal introduction to British high culture through one of its most important consciousness-raising artists. The Royal Albert Hall concert had been planned meticulously for months as Jimmy's golden opportunity to establish himself as a serious artistic force in Britain, with influential music critics, powerful industry executives, and cultural tastemakers in attendance, to evaluate whether reggae consciousness could transcend its Caribbean origins to become a significant force in international popular culture and consciousness-raising education. The concert represented years of hard work and strategic planning by Jimmy's management team, who had secured this prestigious venue and carefully cultivated media attention to ensure maximum impact for what they hoped would be a career-defining performance that could open doors to mainstream success throughout Europe. Canceling the concert would have meant disappointing thousands of devoted fans who had made significant travel arrangements from across the continent, potentially damaging his hard-earned reputation in the British music industry and losing a crucial opportunity to advance reggae consciousness on an international stage that might not be available again for many years. The financial implications were also substantial, with potential lawsuits from the venue, promoters, and disappointed fans who had invested considerable money in travel and accommodation expenses, specifically to witness this historic performance by one of reggae's most important consciousness-raising artists. But performing while his family was grieving seemed like a betrayal of the fundamental values his father had taught him about the paramount importance of family loyalty and cultural traditions that prioritized community support during times of loss and spiritual crisis that required collective strength and mutual assistance from loved ones. Jimmy sat alone in his hotel room for over an hour, wrestling with a decision that seemed to force him to choose between his artistic mission and his family obligations, understanding that whatever choice he made would define his character and influence how he approached similar challenges throughout the remainder of his career and personal life. He thought about his father's teachings regarding the responsibility that came with artistic gifts and the obligation to serve consciousness-raising purposes, even when personal circumstances made such service difficult or emotionally challenging for the artist who carried the burden of inspiring others during their own times of struggle. Patricia called again an hour later, her voice now stronger despite her obvious grief, with words that would ultimately guide Jimmy toward a decision that honored both his father's memory and his artistic responsibilities to the consciousness-raising community that depended on his music for spiritual strength and inspiration during their own difficult times. "Jimmy, I've been thinking about what Papa would want you to do," Patricia said, her voice carrying the wisdom that came from understanding their father's deepest values and priorities. "He always said that your music was bigger than any one person, even our family. He believed that consciousness-raising art could help people heal from their own losses and find strength to continue fighting for their dreams despite seemingly impossible obstacles." These profound words reminded Jimmy of countless conversations with his father about the sacred responsibility that came with artistic gifts and the obligation to serve consciousness-raising purposes even when personal circumstances made such service difficult or emotionally challenging for the artist who carried the burden of inspiring others. Leslie had often told Jimmy that true consciousness-raising artists understood that their music belonged not to them personally, but to everyone who needed spiritual strength and hope, and that this responsibility continued even during times of personal grief and family crisis that tested their commitment to their artistic mission and spiritual calling. Papa used to say that the greatest tribute an artist could give to someone they loved was to continue creating consciousness-raising music that honored their memory while serving people who needed hope and inspiration, Patricia continued, her words helping Jimmy understand how he could honor his father while fulfilling his obligations to his audience and artistic mission. Jimmy realized that his father would want him to perform that night, not despite his grief, but because of it, using his pain and loss to create an even more powerful consciousness-raising experience that could help other people dealing with similar losses and emotional challenges in their own lives and spiritual journeys. Making the most difficult decision of his career, Jimmy decided to perform at Royal Albert Hall that evening, while dedicating the concert to his father's memory, and using his grief to deepen the spiritual impact of his consciousness-raising message for an audience that would witness something unprecedented in popular music history. Jimmy called his tour manager to explain the situation and request that the concert be dedicated to Leslie Chambers' memory, with a moment of silence and an explanation to the audience about why this performance would be different from any other concert they had ever attended in their lives. The afternoon was spent in intense emotional preparation, as Jimmy drew upon his spiritual training and consciousness-raising philosophy to transform his grief into artistic fuel that could serve his audience's needs while honoring his father's memory through the very music and values that Leslie had helped him develop throughout his entire life. When Jimmy arrived at Royal Albert Hall that evening, word had already spread among the audience about his father's death and his courageous decision to perform despite his personal loss, creating an atmosphere of respect and anticipation for what many understood would be an extraordinary and deeply meaningful musical experience. The concert hall was filled with 5,000 people who now understood they were witnessing not just a performance, but a demonstration of how consciousness-raising artists could transform personal tragedy into spiritual service that honored both their loved one's memory and their obligation to provide hope and inspiration to others facing similar challenges. Jimmy took the stage wearing all black as a traditional sign of mourning, carrying his acoustic guitar and the crushing weight of his grief, but also the spiritual strength that came from understanding that this performance would be his greatest tribute to the man who had shaped his artistic vision and consciousness-raising mission throughout his career. Tonight's performance is dedicated to my father, Leslie Chambers, who passed away this morning in Jamaica, Jimmy announced to the hushed audience, his voice carrying both profound grief and unwavering determination. He taught me that consciousness-raising music must continue even in times of personal loss, because people need hope and spiritual strength, especially during their darkest moments, when they feel most alone and abandoned. The audience responded with respectful silence and obvious emotional support, understanding that they were about to witness something extraordinary as Jimmy channeled his grief into what would become one of the most powerful consciousness-raising performances in popular music history. A moment that would be remembered for decades as an example of how authentic artists could transform personal tragedy into spiritual service. Jimmy began with Many Rivers to Cross, the song that had always carried special meaning because of its themes of struggle and perseverance, but which now took on profound new significance as he sang it through tears while drawing upon memories of his father's teachings about overcoming adversity through faith and determination despite seemingly impossible obstacles. His voice carried a raw emotional power that transformed the familiar song into something approaching spiritual testimony, with each word seeming to come directly from his grieving heart, while serving the consciousness-raising purpose of helping others find strength during their own difficult times and personal losses that threatened to overwhelm their faith and determination. The audience was completely silent throughout the song, recognizing that they were witnessing genuine spiritual expression rather than performance entertainment, and that Jimmy was sharing his deepest pain in service of consciousness-raising purposes that transcended normal concert experiences to become something approaching religious ceremony and collective healing. As the concert progressed through beloved songs like You Can Get It If You Really Want and The Harder They Come, Jimmy's grief seemed to deepen rather than diminish the spiritual impact of his consciousness-raising message, proving his father's belief that authentic artists could use personal pain to serve others' needs for hope and inspiration. Each song became a meditation on loss and resilience, with Jimmy's obvious pain adding layers of meaning that revealed how consciousness-raising music could address the deepest human experiences of suffering and transformation, while providing practical guidance for surviving life's most devastating challenges. The performance reached its emotional climax when Jimmy performed an acoustic version of Sitting in Limbo, dedicating it specifically to everyone in the audience who had lost someone they loved and needed to find ways to continue living with purpose despite their grief and emotional pain that threatened to destroy their faith in life's meaning. This song is for my father, but it's also for everyone here tonight who understands what it means to lose someone who shaped your life and your values, Jimmy said, his voice breaking with emotion while maintaining the spiritual strength that allowed him to transform personal pain into service for others. consciousness-raising music teaches us that love continues even after death, and that the best way to honor those we've lost is to keep serving others who need hope and spiritual strength. The song became a moment of collective healing as Jimmy's grief connected with similar losses throughout the audience, creating a consciousness-raising experience that transcended entertainment to become genuine spiritual education about how to transform personal pain into service for others who faced similar challenges and emotional struggles in their own lives. During the performance, many audience members were openly weeping, not just from the emotional power of Jimmy's singing, but from recognition that they were witnessing something unprecedented in popular music, an artist using his greatest personal tragedy to create his most powerful artistic statement while serving others who needed exactly this kind of spiritual guidance and hope. The concert included an impromptu performance of Amazing Grace, which Jimmy sang a cappella while sharing memories of his father singing the same hymn during their family's evening devotions, creating an intimate moment that connected his Caribbean Methodist upbringing with the universal spiritual themes that made consciousness-raising music meaningful to people from all backgrounds and cultures. By the end of the concert, Jimmy had demonstrated that consciousness-raising artists could honor their loved one's memory while serving their artistic mission, proving that the greatest tribute to those who shaped our values is continuing to use our gifts in service of purposes greater than personal comfort or convenience. The standing ovation lasted for over 10 minutes, with many audience members understanding that they had witnessed not just a performance, but a demonstration of how authentic spiritual artists could transform tragedy into service while maintaining their commitment to consciousness-raising principles, even during their own times of greatest loss and emotional devastation. The performance was reviewed as one of the most powerful and moving concerts in Royal Albert Hall's legendary history, with critics praising Jimmy's ability to transform personal tragedy into consciousness-raising art that served his audience's spiritual needs while honoring his father's memory through the very values and artistic vision that Leslie had helped develop throughout their relationship. Music journalists who attended the concert wrote extensively about how Jimmy's grief had actually enhanced rather than diminished his artistic power, proving that consciousness-raising music drew its strength from authentic human experience rather than artificial commercial formulas designed to manipulate emotions for entertainment purposes. The concert was later cited by numerous consciousness-raising artists as an inspiration for how to approach their own work during times of personal crisis, demonstrating that authentic spiritual service often required continuing to perform despite circumstances that might justify canceling or postponing artistic obligations to focus on personal needs. Jimmy flew back to Jamaica the next morning to attend his father's funeral, understanding that he had honored Leslie's memory in the most meaningful way possible by demonstrating how consciousness-raising artists could serve others even during their own times of greatest loss and emotional pain that tested their commitment to their spiritual mission. The funeral service was attended by hundreds of community members who had been touched by Leslie's life and values, with many expressing gratitude to Jimmy for demonstrating through his Royal Albert Hall performance how his father's teachings about service and spiritual responsibility could continue inspiring others even after Leslie's death. During the funeral, Jimmy performed Many Rivers to Cross once again, this time for his family and community, creating a connection between his international artistic mission and his local cultural roots that honored his father's belief that consciousness-raising music should serve both global and community purposes. The concert became legendary in consciousness-raising communities worldwide as an example of how authentic spiritual artists could transform personal grief into service for others, proving that the greatest expressions of love for those we've lost come through continuing to serve purposes that transcend our own comfort and convenience. Years later, Jimmy would cite that Royal Albert Hall performance as the moment he fully understood his father's teachings about the responsibility that comes with artistic gifts and the obligation to serve consciousness-raising purposes, regardless of personal circumstances or emotional challenges that might make such service difficult or emotionally costly. The story inspired countless consciousness-raising artists to understand that authentic spiritual service often requires personal sacrifice and the willingness to transform our own pain into healing for others who face similar struggles and need hope and inspiration to continue fighting for their dreams and spiritual growth despite overwhelming obstacles. Leslie Chambers' death and Jimmy's response to it became a defining moment in reggae history, demonstrating how consciousness-raising music could transcend entertainment to become genuine spiritual service that honored the memory of loved ones while providing hope and inspiration to others facing their own losses and emotional challenges. The Royal Albert Hall concert was later released as a live album titled Songs for Papa, with all proceeds donated to a scholarship fund established in Leslie Chambers' memory to help young Jamaican musicians develop their consciousness-raising artistic skills while remaining grounded in cultural values and family responsibilities. The story continues to inspire contemporary artists who face similar choices between personal obligations and professional commitments, demonstrating that authentic consciousness-raising service sometimes requires making difficult sacrifices that test our commitment to serving purposes greater than our own immediate comfort and emotional needs. Music historians often cite Jimmy's Royal Albert Hall performance as a perfect example of how authentic spiritual artists can transform their most devastating personal experiences into their most powerful artistic statements, proving that consciousness-raising music draws its strength from genuine human emotion rather than artificial commercial formulas. The concert recording remains one of the most requested and emotionally impactful live albums in reggae history, with many listeners reporting that Jimmy's grief-infused performance helped them process their own losses and find strength to continue pursuing their dreams despite overwhelming personal challenges and emotional obstacles. Educational institutions worldwide now use the story of Jimmy's decision and performance as a case study in courses about artistic responsibility, spiritual leadership, and the relationship between personal authenticity and professional obligation in careers that serve consciousness-raising purposes for communities that depend on artists for inspiration and guidance. The Royal Albert Hall performance demonstrated that consciousness-raising music could serve as a bridge between personal tragedy and collective healing, proving that authentic artists could use their own pain to create experiences that helped entire communities process grief, loss, and the challenge of continuing to live meaningfully despite devastating circumstances. Jimmy's example continues influencing consciousness-raising artists across all genres and cultural backgrounds, showing that the most powerful artistic expressions often emerge from our willingness to transform our deepest pain into service for others who need hope, inspiration, and practical guidance for surviving their own difficult times and emotional challenges. The Leslie Chambers Memorial Scholarship Fund has become one of Jamaica's most successful cultural education programs, demonstrating how personal tragedy can be transformed into institutional change that serves future generations of consciousness-raising artists who need both financial support and spiritual guidance to develop their gifts while remaining connected to family and community values. Recipients of the scholarship often visit Leslie Chambers' gravesite before beginning their musical careers, understanding that their artistic development honors the memory of a man who taught his son that consciousness-raising music must serve purposes greater than individual success or personal recognition in competitive industries that often prioritize commercial appeal over authentic spiritual expression.